Okay, get ready, because we're about to explore something pretty out there. Lab-grown meat.
For
For
pets.
pets, yeah, you
Ah.
heard that right. Lab-grown meat, but for our furry friends.
I'm really excited to dig into this one.
Me too.
Yeah.
And I think our listeners are going to be surprised by what we uncover. So to set the stage a little bit, conventional pet food actually has a massive carbon footprint.
Huge.
Yeah.
It's like if pet food were a country, it would be the 60th largest emitter of CO2 in the world.
Wow, I honestly had no idea the impact was that big, especially with the pet population growing all the time. So that's what we're going to explore today. Could lab-grown meat be a viable solution?
A good question for sure. And we've got some excellent research here that really gets into the pros and cons.
Perfect. So let's start with the basics. How is lab-grown meat even made?
Well, it's actually more straightforward than you might think. It involves taking a small sample of animal cells.
Like a muscle cell or something.
Exactly. And then they cultivate these cells in a nutrient-rich environment where they can basically multiply and grow.
So it's real meat,
Yeah.
just produced in a different way.
Exactly. It's real meat, just with a different origin story, which I think is important to emphasize because some people get hung up on the ick factor.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Just sound kind of sci-fi at first.
Right, but it's not like some Frankenstein food or anything. It's a natural process just happening in a more controlled setting.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And to be honest, some of the stuff that goes into conventional pet food can be pretty questionable.
Yeah.
I've been trying to be more conscious about what I feed my pets, but it's like navigating a minefield with all the fillers and additives and who knows what else.
It's definitely a concern. Even with the trend toward more natural pet food options, there are still a lot of questions about the quality of the ingredients.
Okay, so lab-grown meat kind of sidesteps those concerns. But the big question is it actually more sustainable?
Well, the research we have here suggests that it is. The data is actually pretty compelling. It says lab-grown meat production uses 45% less energy than traditional beef farming.
45% less. That's pretty significant.
It is, and get this, if the production is powered by renewable energy sources, the potential reduction in greenhouse gases jumps to 92%.
Wow, 92%.
Uh-huh.
So feeding our furry friends could actually be part of the solution to climate change. That's a pretty powerful thought.
Absolutely. It's a game changer.
But is it even legal? I mean, is this stuff regulated?
Yeah.
Where does it stand from a legal perspective?
Well, that's where things get interesting. The UK is actually ahead of the curve on this. They're the only country in Europe that has specifically approved lab-grown meat for pet food.
Really? Why is the UK leading the charge here?
It's hard to say for sure, but their exit from the EU might actually be playing a role. They're not bound by the same regulations and pressures from the continent's agricultural sector.
Ah, so they have a bit more freedom to move forward with this.
Exactly. Remember the whole debate over the term vegan milk? The EU's farming industry is very powerful, and they're resistant to anything that could disrupt the status quo.
Makes sense. So the UK has a real opportunity here to become a leader in this emerging market.
A huge opportunity. They could attract investment, establish themselves as a hub for innovation. It's pretty exciting.
It is. But let's be real for a second. Isn't this stuff going to be crazy expensive?
Cost is definitely a hurdle right now. Lab-grown meat is still in its early stages of development, so production costs are high.
I can imagine. It's like those first-generation smartphones. You pay a premium for being an early adopter.
Exactly. But as with any new technology, we can expect the price to come down as production becomes more efficient. And of course, there's always the possibility of government subsidies to help accelerate the process.
Subsidies like financial support from the government to help the industry grow.
Precisely. It's not a new concept. Traditional agriculture receives a lot of government support in many countries.
I see their point. Yeah, but it does raise some questions about fairness. Is it right to use taxpayer money to support a brand new industry when there are so many other pressing needs?
It's definitely a valid concern and a debate worth having. But proponents of this technology argue that the potential long-term benefits, both economic and environmental, outweigh the initial investment.
Okay, I see both sides. So we've got the potential environmental benefits, the economic upside for the UK, and a regulatory green light. But what about the bigger picture? Is lab-grown meat just for pets, or is there a future for human consumption as well?
That's a great question, and one that this research explores. It actually suggests that lab-grown meat for ready meals and even fast food could be the next step.
Wow, now that's something I'd be curious to try.
Me too. Imagine walking into your favorite burger joint and having the option of a lab-grown patty.
That's a future I could get behind. But before we get too carried away, let's dive a little deeper into the potential of lab-grown meat for human consumption and what it could mean for the future of food.
That sounds like a plan. Let's do it.
Yeah,
Yeah, it really makes you think about the possibilities.
it does. But let's get real for a second. Would people even want to eat meat that came from a lab?
That's a great question. I mean, there's definitely a certain appeal to a traditional steak. You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure. I love a good grilled steak.
Yeah, it's about more than just the food itself. It's about the whole experience, the culture, the tradition.
So you're saying it's not just about the science. It's also about how we feel about it emotionally.
Absolutely. Our perceptions of food are so deeply connected to our personal experiences and cultural background.
It's like that whole debate over the term vegan milk.
Yeah,
The dairy industry flipped out because they know people have strong emotional attachments to the food they eat.
exactly. It's about those feelings and associations more than just the product itself.
It's like sparkling wine versus champagne.
Yeah.
Right? Technically, they're both sparkling wine. But the word champagne evokes a sense of luxury and celebration.
Exactly. So if we want people to embrace lab-grown meat, we need to create a new narrative, a new way of thinking about it.
So instead of calling it fake meat, which has a negative connotation, we should use terms like cultivated meat.
I think that's a smart move. It positions it as something new and innovative, not just a cheap imitation.
Like how plant-based burgers have kind of carved out their own niche. They're not trying to be beef burgers. There's something different altogether.
That's a great analogy. And think about the potential culinary applications chefs could experiment with different types of cells, creating unique textures and flavors that we've never seen before.
Now that's something I'd be willing to try. It sounds like a whole new frontier of culinary innovation.
It really is.
Yeah.
But let's not get too carried away. There are definitely some challenges ahead.
Oh, for sure. Like what?
Well, scaling up production to meet potential demand is going to be huge. And then there's the issue of affordability. This technology is still relatively new, so the costs are high.
Right. It's like buying the first generation of any new tech. You're paying a premium for being an early adopter.
Exactly. But as production becomes more efficient, we can expect the price to come down. And remember those government subsidies we talked about? Those could help accelerate the process.
So it's a bit of a waiting game for now.
Yeah.
We have this potentially groundbreaking technology, but it needs time to mature and become more accessible.
That's a good way to put it. But the UK's decision to approve lab-grown pet food could be a catalyst for change. It's a small step, but it shows a willingness to embrace innovation.
Maybe it's a sign of things to come.
I think so. It's definitely a development worth watching. Who knows, maybe one day we'll all be enjoying lab-grown burgers at a football game.
Now that's a future I'm excited about. But we've been focusing a lot on the environmental and economic aspects of lab-grown meat. Are there any other considerations we should be thinking about?
Absolutely. There are definitely ethical implications to consider. For example, lab-grown meat could potentially eliminate the need for factory farming.
Which will be a huge win for animal welfare.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it could also help reduce the risk of zoonotic diseases like the next pandemic.
That's a really good point. It's like a domino effect. One change can lead to a cascade of others.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. And that's what makes exploring these cutting-edge topics so fascinating. It's not just about a new food source. It's about rethinking our relationship with the world around us.
This has given me a lot to think about, that's for sure. But let's not get lost in the hypothetical future just yet. As we said, the UK is still the only country in Europe that has approved lab-grown meat for pets.
Right. It's still early days.
But it puts them in a unique position. They have the opportunity to shape regulations, attract investment, and become a global hub for this emerging industry.
It's like they've been handed a blank canvas, and they get to create a whole new vision for food production.
That's a powerful image. But it won't be easy. They'll face pushback from vested interests, and there will be ongoing debates about the ethics and consumer acceptance of this technology.
It's going to be a wild ride, that's for sure.
Definitely. But let's shift our focus back to the U.S. for a minute. You remember that quote from the Florida state representative about real meat being made by God?
Oh, yeah, how could I forget? That one really stuck with me.
It really highlights how deeply ingrained our beliefs about food and tradition can be.
And it underscores the potential for conflict as this technology advances. I think the debate about lab-grown meat in the U.S. is likely to become even more polarized, especially with an election year coming up.
It almost feels like a microcosm of the larger cultural divide we're seeing in society as a whole.
I think you're right. You have those who embrace innovation and see lab-grown meat as a solution to some of our biggest challenges, and then you have those who are wary of change and see it as a threat to their way of life.
It's a classic clash of values.
Right.
But like any technological disruption, there will be winners and losers.
Mm-hmm.
The key is to figure out how to manage this transition in a way that benefits everyone.
Easier said than done, but it's definitely the goal.
Well, I don't have all the answers, but
Yeah.
I'm certainly fascinated by the conversation. I bet our listeners are buzzing with their own thoughts and questions too.
I'm sure they are. It's always rewarding to explore these cutting-edge topics and see how they connect to the larger questions facing our world.
Speaking of big questions, I'm curious about the long-term implications of lab-grown meat for human consumption. Do you think it's a realistic solution to global food security?
That's a great question, and one that our research actually addresses in some detail.
Okay, you've got my attention. What do they have to say?
Let's dive into their findings in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, lay it on me. What does the research say about lab-grown meat and food security?
Well, it's pretty optimistic, actually. They argue that lab-grown meat could be a game changer, especially when you consider how resource-intensive traditional animal agriculture is.
Yeah, it takes a ton of land-water energy, all to raise livestock.
Not to mention the ethical concerns we talked about earlier.
Right. Factory farming is a
Overwork.
whole other can of worms.
Exactly. But lab-grown meat could offer a more efficient and sustainable way to produce meat without relying on those large-scale farming practices.
That's the idea. It's about doing things differently.
So less environmental impact, improved animal welfare,
Yeah.
and we could potentially feed more people with fewer resources.
A win-win-win. I like the sound of that. But they do acknowledge it's not going to be an easy fix.
Right, of course not. Scaling up production to meet global demand, that's a huge undertaking. And then there's the cost factor. We know lab-grown meat is still expensive to produce.
So it's not a magic bullet, but it's a promising innovation with a lot of potential.
I think that's a fair assessment. The research really emphasizes that government support is going to be crucial.
To help the industry grow.
Exactly. They compare it to the renewable energy sector, which received a lot of government subsidies in its early stages.
And look at how that turned out.
Exactly. Renewable energy is transforming the energy landscape. And they believe lab-grown meat could do the same for food production.
So it's about creating the right conditions for innovation to flourish.
Precisely. They argue that the potential benefits for humanity and the planet are so significant that it warrants strategic investment.
It's about taking the long view.
Exactly. Recognizing that this could be a key part of a more sustainable and equitable food system for future generations.
You know, I have to admit, I'm feeling pretty optimistic after this deep dive. It's not every day you come across a technology with this much potential to address so many critical issues.
It's definitely exciting. And it's encouraging to see how the conversation is evolving. Even a few years ago, this was considered pretty fringe. Now it's on the radar of governments, investors, major food companies.
It's amazing how quickly things can change when an idea's time has come.
That's for sure. But we're still in the early stages. There's a lot of research and development ahead, and there will be challenges along the way.
Of course.
Yeah.
But as we've seen, the potential rewards are enormous. This could be a real revolution in food production, one that benefits both people and the planet.
It's a future worth working towards, and I'm eager to see what happens next.
Me too.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've covered a lot of ground today, the science, the economics, the potential impact, but ultimately the decision of whether or not to embrace lab-grown meat is a personal one.
Absolutely. There's no right or wrong answer here.
It's about weighing the information, considering your values, and deciding what feels right for you.
Exactly.
So we're turning it over to you, our listeners. If lab-grown meat became widely available and affordable, would you feed it to your pet? Would you try it yourself? These are questions worth pondering as we stand at this fascinating crossroads in the evolution of our food system.
Food for thought indeed.
I love it. Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explore the world of lab-grown meat. It's a topic that's sure to keep evolving. So stay curious, and we'll see you next time.